Hello, Delia. Good to see you.
Hi, great to see you.
Thanks for coming on the pod to talk about ISO. And
Favorite thing.
yeah, Eva sends her apologies. She is with no voice, and that is a problem when you're a podcaster. So yeah, sadly, she can't make it. But
Yeah,
gladly, the two of us have a voice.
yeah.
And so let's dive in. I mean, ISO has really come onto the radar of most people quite recently, I would say, over the last year or two. Um, and before everything was about SBTi. I know that you've been involved with the ISO greenhouse gas protocol process f- from the start, pretty much. So maybe we start with how did you get involved? Why did you get involved? How's it been going?
Okay, yes, good question. So I also knew nothing about ISO when I got involved. That was 2 years ago it started, actually. Exactly 2 years ago was the first meeting. And the reason I got involved is because the person who is in charge of net zero at the British Standards Institute that put in the net zero standard as a piece of work, uh, begged us to have somebody who knew something about removals because she knew that it was going to be a difficult thing to get into the standard. And so she was working out who needed to be in the conversation to make sure that it was really dealing with the issues that were actually happening on the ground and not people's sort of vague knowledge of something called removals that they didn't know really how to work with it. I have to admit that when she asked me, I was really like, how much time? I don't really want to do this. I insisted that everybody else in our organization sign up too, so that I wasn't stuck with it. The first conversations, and this is like 130 people from all over the world, all different groups on a Zoom call. At the beginning, all venting a bit on, why do we need this and what's it all about? Because we already have carbon neutrality and so on. So it was quite a weird process, but I realized very quickly, and this is why I stuck with it, that it's about developing a global consensus with all these people that would need to be
Wow.
using this, and that there's a lot of, if you're prepared to put in the work, you can run a group. So I immediately said, okay, I'll run an ad hoc group on removals, and you get like 20 or 40 people joining that group, you organizing it, but you can help then draft what is in the standard. So if you don't get involved, it's unlikely to be there. If you do get involved, you can really shape the conversation because a lot of it is based on what do people know and what do they not know. So that was how I reluctantly got involved, but then became very obsessed by making sure that we got something in there that would work.
Well, I think on behalf of the sector, thank you.
You're welcome. I did actually enjoy it. I know it sounds like a nightmare, but it actually was quite fun. Uh,
And this is kind of where I wanted to go next because ISO has a lot of credibility. Right? It's kind of this, I think everyone's come across it in some area of their lives. It has a lot of credibility with governments as well. And so I'm curious, how does that translate into ambition within this standard? Like, how did you see, the work unfold when it comes to the specific one? And how does that kind of merge with the expectation, I guess, that ISO comes with, which is different to SBTi, for example?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, people know ISO in a weird way, right? Like, the technical specifications for a window
Yeah.
or something. So it doesn't really fit into the way you think about net zero. But actually, ISO has been doing environmental management standards for, I think it's like 20 years or something like that. So it's been around a long time working on sort of more general standards. This particular one, though, was a little bit different. They had to normally, the way that ISO works, it's organized around national standards bodies. Every national standards body decides who to send into the working group on a specific standard. So it can be sort of anybody, if you are passed by your national standards body. Um, in this one, they had to limit each country to 4 people because there was such a push and a kind of lobbying push also, a sort of countries where this was very important wanted to have lots and lots of people in there. So they limited it to 4 people. And from the beginning, it had this sort of much more politicized feel to it, like the importance of this, because it can set the policy for governments. The governments, because it's part of the World Trade Organization framework, governments can use whatever comes out of the standard to say this is what our companies need to do. So it has a potential cloud, that is really wide reaching if it's a good standard. So you asked the question about ambition. It's really, this is what the woman who asked me to come in, she was making sure that a lot of NGOs got involved that didn't know anything about the ISO standard. And she managed to get a range, which in some ways was overwhelming, because you had, the most purist climate organizations up to the Saudi Ministry of Energy, all in the same room, lots of companies, all different countries with very, very different interests, all debating issues. And at the beginning, it felt like you would never be able to get ambition. What I found really fascinating is that within a year or so of really getting drafts down in isolated bits of the standard, there was a kind of shared sense that we needed to find the line between ambition and usability, sort of, credibility and usability. And so we were always walking this line and always trying to find a kind of consensus that would match that level of ambition. So, if you imagine it in relation to SBTi that was going on at the same time, same process, and SBTi was involved in the ISO process as well.
Interesting.
We were trying to make sure that we didn't create a kind of gap that would allow companies to go, well, if SBTi is too strong, too robust, then we'll use the ISO one, which will be much easier. We were trying to avoid that kind of a calculation and really just think through what would be useful globally for all companies and countries. What could they use to say this is what a net zero aligned organization looks like, this is what it needs to do.
And I want to get into the specifics in a second, but just because you opened that space, I think a lot of people are confused by what space SBTi versus ISO takes on, right?
Yeah.
And as you said, you wanted to make sure that you don't create a gap. But then if there's no gap, the question is it duplication?
What's the point of it?
How is it complementary,
Yeah.
right? So can you just paint the picture from your perspective, ISO or versus SBTi?
So, SBTi is a target setting organization for, very companies that want to be leading in climate action. The net zero aligned organization standard, that's the full name of the standard, was trying to pull in a broader scope of action. So first of all, it was trying to be something that could be globally applicable. So, a good example of this is, the SBTi consensus is that, a net zero date after 2050 would be impossible. The work that was done within the ISO group, containing all of these countries that have, like China has 2060 and Saudi Arabia has 2070, and what we did is a piece of work, and it's all volunteers, right? There was the guy in Switzerland who worked through what would an equitable framework look like that could still meet climate goals and could accommodate different end net zero date. Yeah. So obviously some people have to do more and some people are allowed to have their net zero date later. And these were fascinating conversations.
I can imagine.
Because there's the worry about the credibility of the thing, but at the same time there is this is what we're trying to achieve. And there were conversations, and that's one of the things that is for me was really changed some of the ways that I was thinking on removals. There was a guy from Zimbabwe, for example, who said, look, if I go back and say to the companies that I work with, in order to have any kind of claims or action on net zero, you have to have already set your targets, written your transition plan, allocated budgets, had your leadership doing this, that, and the other. That was where we had our first sort of claim stage. They're just going to go, it's not for me. I can't do that. I'm nowhere near that. So at that point, we introduced like an on-ramp claim that said, for those companies that have not been doing climate work so far, this is the stage where you say, we are going to set a net zero target and we're going to do it in this way with this guidance. And that's a sort of good example of how you need to work with the consensus to sort of make sure that you get something that is both credible and usable, but allows that sort of global application. So SBTi doesn't have to think in that kind of way and has to be much stricter on the, what it
That's really
can
interesting.
do. But this is about thinking through things. And if we start talking about the removals part, I can show you some specific examples where we were thinking, okay, that would be really problem. There was one time when I had Costa Rica, Kenya, and Malaysia shouting at me when I was presenting what we were going to do on removals, what it would mean for their countries and their forestry projects. I, of course, had never even thought about that. It's not something that comes up. So you get this kind of input coming in from a whole slew of different countries with very different interests, and you're forced to grapple with what that means.
So interesting because SBTi feels like it has a stricter, a more narrow scope because it's self-selecting and companies volunteer to be under SBTi, and so it can have a uniform approach that they dictate. I would also say the incentives are definitely aligned differently, right? Whereas with ISO, the way you describe it, you need a much broader solution, a much more solution that fits much more different contexts.
Yeah.
But within that, you can potentially be more ambitious in some ways, right?
Yes.
And that's kind of what and maybe let's get to the specifics now. I mean, the main thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that I take away is that with the ISO, the milestones for removals start 5 years after target setting, right? So that could be before 2035, which is where SBTi really kicks in, right? So in that sense, it feels more ambitious. But what are the key kind of the headline facts on removals within ISO?
Yeah. So when we started this process, we had I spent a lot of time thinking about what it is that we really want to make sure comes out of this. So the outcome that we have, and both ISO and SBTi face this problem. You've got a net zero framework. So the net zero framework says, you're going to have removals, right, later, and there is no mechanism for making the companies do that now. There's no reason that any company within that framework shouldn't just turn around in 2049 and say, okay, let's go to market and buy a few removal credits for our residual emissions. And as we know, that means that the removals wouldn't be there because you need to build up this industry. So that was the problem statement we began with, and we made sure that everybody understood that and that we needed to have a solution to that. So the solution would have to address, how do we build up an industry that has durability, that also covers other removals as well, the nature-based removals that are already there, that we have all of that in there, but that makes it possible for companies to act according to their own business strategies in a way that is relevant to them, because it covers all sectors, but means that they have to start within the next 5 years. And whatever happens after 5 years, in some ways, we don't need to worry about, because ISO standards are reviewed every 5 years. Now, obviously, you can't review everything, you can't change everything, but the most important thing is what you release in the next 5 years. So that was how we went into the thing. And what we've ended up doing is making the implicit removals target in net zero frameworks explicit. So the first thing that you have to do is when you're setting your net zero target, so when you're putting together a transition plan, setting the target, you set a long-term reduction target, and whatever is left over, that is your anticipated residual emissions. Doesn't matter whether it's real, whether it's based on top-down, you take it as your proxy, and you are encouraged to get more honest, to ground truth that as you go along. So what starts as a top-down, as everybody's been doing, 10% that came from the sort of SBTi thinking, if that's all you're doing, 10%, fine. But over time, you make that into something that is realistic. You ground truth that. But you have to work with your proxy from the beginning. So you have your, whatever it is, let's say your 10%, which is your separate removal target then. And that has to be reported. It's part of your transition plan. And your transition plan has to have a strategy for getting there. And you can, we have all sorts of options in there. I wanted to give people the sense that you can do this in many different ways. You can have a portfolio of credits. You can have, removals in your operations. You can have it in your value chain. All of that is absolutely fine.
Do you have guidance on amounts?
Is it amounts?
Like, do you have guidance on
the amounts?
Percentages? Yeah.
No, the percentage is, we're not giving the guidance. They're setting a long-term reduction target, which is like the primary instruments of a net zero framework. So let's say that framework gets you to, leaves you with 100,000 tons. That's your anticipated residual emissions target. And we were trying, I was trying, I don't know, this is one of the difficulties is in how you encourage companies to actually be open about the challenges they're facing on decarbonization. So when you're talking to different companies, hard to abate companies, they'll often be saying we have no idea. 20% residual emissions, 25%. We don't know how to get to something like 10%. And over time, we need to be encouraging that kind of a conversation. So quite a few things actually in the standard are designed to encourage a kind of honesty and transparency around what is working and what is not working. So there's also, ways, if you haven't met your target, what you need to do. And a lot of that is around saying what went wrong, how you're going to fix it. And it's the same sort of logic with the residual emissions. If you see in your sector, in your company, that within 10 years you're getting nowhere near the 10% or whatever it was that you put there, you have to expand that. And that means you have to adjust your removals target to meet what you then see as your residual emissions. It may be that it's less, of course, whatever it is, that you have to take that reality. But the important thing for now is that it doesn't matter what the reality will be. Whatever you have put as your long-term reduction target, whatever is left over to zero, that's what you have to work towards. And you just...
But how are these residual emissions calculated? Do you have any guidance per sector? I'm just asking because I know you mentioned the 10% kind of SBTi, 5 to 10%.
Yeah.
But then we saw in the latest state of CDR that they actually had an average of 16%.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. And so it's a very
debatable
guidance, topic.
Yeah, the guidance is not on the removals. The guidance is on the quantification of your reduction target. And there's lots of guidance on what you can use, what sectoral guidance you can use. So whatever is out there is what you use. So you're basically taking that, exactly that sort of reality that came from the State of CDR report that, it looks more like 16%. If that's what it is, that's what you take. If you're not yet ready to say that that's what it is, which is, partly what is happening in these discussions where it's easier just to take a sort of top-down thing, then you'll be taking less. But you'll be working right from the beginning. And, all your transition planning has to include that sort of removals strategy in there and the trajectory you aim to reach, how you're going to do it. And the first milestone, what you were mentioning, the 5 years, is that the first milestone is 5 years from your starting date. So at that point, you have to have reached what is in your milestone. And your milestone could be, let's say you're a mining company that is working on, ERW on the farms around it. That would be something where your milestone might be that you've built your rock grinding facility, or you've got the investment going in there and it's under construction. Or it might be that you have a linear trajectory and a portfolio of credits where you're expanding the durability over time, a sort of more...
That's completely flexible. I'm just trying to understand
completely
kind of that first
flexible.
milestone.
The first milestone is you have to decide as a company how you are going to get to your removals target. And your first milestone it all has to be validated and, verified. So you have to explain to an outside person how you would get to your your overall target on your trajectory. So you have to have a trajectory that is defensible, and then you have to have investments that are defensible towards that. And if
Who's
those
that
are
person? Because you said that outside person. Who will check
so this
that?
is all of ISO standards have to be verifiable and validatable, capable of validation. So for the plans, the one thing is you can't say in an ISO standard. So this is maybe different from SBTi has created its own validation organization. For ISO, there are hundreds of aligned verification organizations that work with net zero, that work with ISO standards, and will work with the net zero standard. So these are people who go through and ask for. So let's take the mining company, right? Where it's a weird one, where it's not a number of removals that is aiming to reach at that time. They would have to look at, okay, the contracts for the rock grinding facility, the feasibility study done, the investment allocated. So they would check those things in order to say, okay, you're on track for what you're saying you're going to do.
Okay, but playing devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
I can see how this very decentralized network of verifiers could verify if or stress test if what the company said they're actually doing. But I really struggle to see how they could assess the level of ambition in any way of that milestone, right? Because they would need contextual information about carbon removals, about carbon removal trajectories. And so you might end up with very low ambition milestones, no?
I don't. This is the question. You either have to be prescriptive, or you have to give the principles under which a company acts. So this was for SBTi, the reason not to have a residual emissions target, if you remember, they were talking about that at one point, was because they would have had to have prescribed exactly what that would be for all companies. And there were all these percentages going around over the last few years of what that could be. And companies freaked out, right? Companies said, we can't do that. It's too restrictive on it. It's too prescriptive. So the solution has been to say, okay, we'll push that into the future from 2035. Now, it's still within, it's still encouraged, it's fine, but we still have this gap between now, because this is the missing piece in all of this. When you're writing the standard, you have to pin that down. How are you going to make companies do something now? How are you going to link their organizational removal strategy or net zero strategy to what we need to reach global net zero? That is the missing piece. How do you make those two things work? So for SBTi, that is something that's coming with the ongoing emissions responsibility from 2035. With ISO, it is you have to, as a company, develop and justify a strategy of getting to an anticipated residual emissions target that you have to set, which is an amount. So you have to justify that. And you're right, this is going to be, a lot of this will depend on, are those verification bodies capable of having that kind of a conversation with the companies. But that is the same for all ISO standards, right? It's the same process for all of the standards. That if you can use it just as guidance, but if you're going to have that verified, you need to have verification organizations that are capable of that. So actually, a lot of the discussions within the group, there are a lot of verification companies that were part of the process. They would constantly be saying to us, and how would we verify that? How would we validate that? And so you had to come from something that's kind of like, general to something that is really quite specific, and you have to decide. And this is one of the I found it so interesting, having thought through for so many years as you do, in our conversations of what you need companies to do. But the difficulty in the standard is that you have to pin it down and say, this is what you should do. And either you shall do it, you're absolutely required to do it. You should do it. It means you're recommended to do it. You may do it. You have to pull those different options in so that you can make sure that companies they're not sort of forced down one path, but they
Yeah.
are strongly incentivized to act in a way that makes sense. So, I mean, what you're saying is correct. And I remember one time I was looking at what we'd written and called up my co-founder Gabriel, and after waking up in the morning thinking, I don't think that I've got enough of a push to do this. So we worked through it, what sort of details you need to have in there to make sure that you're actually getting action now. But that was the solution we've come up with. And there is, if it's really interesting to get the challenge, and we should be collecting that, because what's come out in ISO is not the final standard, right? It's the
Yeah,
final
it's a draft.
draft
Yeah.
for a public consultation process. And although the public consultation process works in a sort of different way than like an SBTi or whatever else people have been involved in, it all goes through the national standards bodies. But this is the point for the market, the ecosystem, to come back and say, this bit is too weak. We need something more here, because that will be taken into account in the discussions, to the end of the year when a final draft will then come out.
No, I appreciate what's being done here, and I appreciate the trying to create something that will get as many companies as possible to start thinking about this and to start doing something, right? But at the same time, when I think about ISO, I think about something that means the same in different places, right? That I can trust as an outsider, that ISO standard applied in this place is the same as this. What I'm hearing is that two companies could have wildly different levels of ambition. And when it comes to removals, right? One company could have a clear roadmap with percentage milestones, ramping up gradually, or could start buying after 5 years, right? And the other one could have a very different, much slower path. But they would both get the same ISO certification.
I am not sure that is completely true. So it depends on, as I said, that the setting of the amount of removals that you need is defined by the reduction target, not by
at net zero. Yes.
At net zero.
Yeah.
So you can't just choose any old reduction target. That is defined as, sectoral based, these ones, that one, the other. So whatever you end up with, you have something that is designed to get you to net zero. So it has a sort of strong reduction, but with something left over. So all the companies are working with that leftover and have to constantly revise and justify that amount within their transition plans. So within that, they have then an investment strategy. The difference between, I don't know whether when you're looking at that, the mining company that is developing the rock grinding facility compared to the company that is developed a portfolio of credits with durability increasing towards its net zero, is that a different level of ambition? It's a different strategy. It fits differently within a business strategy. But we want to have that kind of, we can see that scale. This one of the things that's been interesting in the development of the removals ecosystem in the past year or so has been this sort of understanding of how removals can be brought into existing operations in different ways, into cement, into wastewater, and so on. And one of the things that I was very, very conscious of is not sort of pushing everybody down the removal credits route, when actually
I like the
these
flexibilities.
companies, we need to do this. So you need to have, ISO says, it's interesting what you're bringing in the other standards where it's prescriptive, but it's not prescriptive in describing the strategy that the company should take. It's prescriptive in the context for which it makes the decisions in that strategy.
Yeah, understood. And then if I can ask you, because we're almost out of time, but one thing that obviously everyone will want to know is what's the route to impact, right? Like once the standard, maybe when do you think the standard will actually be finalized? And then what are the channels for adoption and for enforcement?
Yeah. So it will be by the end of the year, all the comments that come in will be put into a final draft, and the national standards bodies then vote yes or no. This should be a standard or it should not be a standard. So, it depends whether there is enough support within the standards bodies. Let's assume there is. It will come out, let's say, by the middle of 2027 at the latest. At that point, there are a lot of people already working with different government bodies, and that's also part of the consultation process for there to be a sort of national understanding within each country of what this means, how governments could use it, how companies could use it, and that's the process that's now starting off now that it's been launched. So there are governments that are looking at this and saying, okay, we think that we could either take that wholesale, or we could adapt that in some way or another and require that all our companies do it. So, let's imagine that would be something that would support the CBAM, exporting companies. That's been one of the things that I've noticed has encouraged companies to be really focusing it.
Yeah.
So the route to impact is, it may be that there are companies that go, okay, that's more interesting for me, I'll take that rather than SBTi, that have been on SBTi, but that's not really the point of it, right? You could use both if you wanted to, but you could also more likely what is the route to impact is that companies that have not been using this, not using any guidance at all, will be encouraged then to get on, or required to get on by their governments. So that's
Excellent.
where the work is now focused, to make sure that there is that kind of understanding. Because the route to non-impact is that nobody knows that it's come out and nothing happens, and that can also happen. So there is a need to focus on how you get that impact. Yeah.
Excellent, Delia. Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. And yeah, thank you for sharing, and thank you for taking part in the process.
Thank you.
On behalf of this community.
Yeah. Thanks, Sebastian.
Bye.
Bye.